Mr. Ellis, first, good luck with your campaign. Could you please tell us about your past history as a leader and also why you think you need to join this campaign?
My past actually consists of a lot of community work prior to being elected as a leader of my community. My community is Kitimat Village, BC. It's a small village on the west coast of British Columbia, about 800 people, 900 people. And so I got elected to the council then. So I spent 8 years as an elected leader. And after that, I became the elected chief councillor for 6 years. And it was always about how do we build a future, how do we build successful people, and how do we build up our families and our communities. And that's where I come from.
And other than municipal and tribal politics and leadership, what is your experience in provincial politics?
I have a lot of experience over from 2003 to 2017 working with the provincial government as well as the federal government, specifically in projects like LNG, exports to Asia. I also worked a lot with them with forestry and mining. And I actually worked on a lot of relationship protocols, trying to get First Nations to work well with government so that we could actually build major projects like LNG Canada or Chevron's KLNG project.
And how you think those are important and precious experience in your campaign and in what you can bring to the BC Liberal Party and the British Columbia?
Well, it brings a lot of experience because it really started with community. It started with people, making sure that Aboriginals from all over BC could engage in economy and rebuild their lives. But it had more to do with building up the region and building up the province and actually creating a relationship, not just with the provincial government and the federal government, but with companies out of Korea, for example, or China, or Japan, or Africa. It actually held a lot of experiences for me at the local level, provincial level, national level, and international level. And that's what I'd like to bring back to BC is an international relationship in terms of trade and relationships.
You have always reiterated that your campaign and your leadership is different from other candidates. What you can bring to the table is also different from other candidates. You are a grassroots, you are a people's leader. So could you please reiterate more on that and give us more detail why, how grassroots campaign will improve and help BC Liberal Party?
Well, number one, I'm a minority in BC. I'm a First Nations person. So I understand what it's like to be a minority living in BC and Canada for that matter. In fact, I go back to my ancestors, including my parents, my grandparents, that actually interacted with minorities from other countries, Japan and China, specifically in the canneries, for instance, on the fishing grounds. And there's one thing they had in common. They were trying to make their way in a society that wasn't very tolerant of minorities at the time. It's gotten better, but we still got a ways to go in terms of inclusion. On the other side of that, in the 80s and the 90s, as a young man with a family, I struggled to find a job. Couldn't find a job. And so I did a lot of small business. I did some construction. I worked for DFO. I did some logging. I did just about everything I could to think of to get food on the table and clothes on the backs of my children. So in that experience, I did a little bit of everything. But I never, so I took that experience and I made a promise that the next generation of people, of British Columbians, would never have to struggle the way I struggled. And so that's what I mean by grassroots. And I think that's why so many people actually find our campaign so appealing.
And you mentioned about this is, you understand the hardship and difficulties of ordinary people, working class. how that makes you different from other candidates, the so-called old school candidates who have been in politics for a long time, who have been on the upper echelon of power. So how different your campaign is with those so-called old school leaders?
Mine's from the ground up. I've always thought about the person that needs help, the person that has to get off welfare, the person that has to get off unemployment insurance, needs a really good paying job. I also think about the people that are marginalized in today's society, whether that's due to race or economic standards. I've always thought, because that's where I was, that's where I came from, that's where my people came from. And we have a tradition in our community, First Nations, that we always respect the elders for their storytelling. And for me, it was the storytelling in the last 50 years, 100 years, 200 years. And so I remember all the hardships. I remember all the residential schools. I remember the racism. I remember my dad telling me once, he remembers a time on a sign outside a bar said, "No dogs and Indians allowed." The funny part for him was they put dogs first. They didn't put Indians. But they worked through it. Both my parents went to residential school, but they worked hard. My mom actually created a really good family life. My dad, went to work in construction, logging, fishing. And so when I hear stories from British Columbians who are struggling, whether they be immigrants or they're going through a bad time, or whether they're actually experiencing some type of exclusion, I understand that. I fully understand it. And so I want to build a strong economy, much like the BC Liberals did back in the 2000s, but I want to build a strong economy for everybody. And I want to build a system where the less fortunate can actually get some assistance in getting to success.
So what are the plan, or say your campaign platform, that will achieve what you want to build for British Columbia?
Well, number one, I don't like division politics. I don't like that. I don't like separating British Columbians. And as an Indigenous person, I know what that's like. We've been fighting hard to be included in the economy of BC, and we succeeded. We actually achieved the LNG Canada project, the $40 billion LNG project that's going to export natural gas to Asia. We did it. But the key was we did it together. And for me, that's what I come down to, is that I'm not looking to get elected by dividing people. I want people to come together. And we can do it. If First Nations can come together with a non-Indigenous population and actually achieve a $40 billion project, the largest in Canadian history, there's no reason why we can't do this for the rest of BC, whether we're talking about forestry, mining, the technological sector, the tourism sector. It can be done. But for this time and period, I'm asking everybody that you have to put down your political weapons, and we got to think about the future of BC. We need a strong economy if we're going to pay for the programs like highways, hospitals, schools. We need a strong economy.
So economy is the first thing on your platform. And how about other social problems that we are facing now? We are facing poverty. We are facing increasing racism. And what are your plans to curb those problems?
Well, the same way that we curbed racism in our area: education, conversation, and understanding the history of Canada, understanding the history of where the people from around the world came to BC, what they had to go through. I knew essentially what the Asian community went through. I knew what the Indo-Canadian community went through, just based on the stories of my ancestors. But during this campaign, I've actually been welcomed into the Indo-Canadian community, I've been welcomed into the Chinese community, and I've learned so much more. It's not just a simple black and white answer in terms of what's really inside the communities of BC. If you really want to understand what's happening, you really got to get in there, and you got to talk to them, you got to engage with them, you got to eat with them, and you got to talk with them. If we can do this, and then we can actually communicate this out to the rest of BC, that ethnic minorities want to be part of BC too. They want to be included. And that's what I'm getting from a lot of the people in Richmond and Surrey, for example, and Cranbrook. Then we can start to break down these barriers. But the racism, I think, is actually stemming from the division that we're seeing in BC. And that goes back to why I don't not like the politics of division. I don't like that.
What do you see are the biggest problem in our political system now? You mentioned about division, and we have seen our party system is like there is a ruling party, there is the opposition party, and sometimes the opposition party is opposing just for the sake of opposition. If you are going to be the leader of the Liberal Party, first, of course, as the leader of the opposition, and possibly after the next provincial election will be the ruling party. But how are you going to lead a opposition party and then a government?
It's the nature of the government system in BC, and Canada for that matter. It's called the Westminster model, where the opposition's job is to question the government. That's their job. They're called the official opposition. The BC Liberals right now are the official opposition. But in my previous leadership, I didn't know about this system. But when I was chief counselor for 6 years, we accumulated tremendous wealth. We accumulated tremendous prosperity and great success. But through that whole time, I encouraged my people to question me, ask me questions. And most of the answers came back was that they trusted me, which I appreciated. But that is not the kind of governance I wanted. I wanted a government that could be questioned and the government would actually give forthright answers. And that's the whole meaning behind being transparent and accountable. I believe that a government's there for the people. It's not the opposite. This is not a career. Being in government, especially in terms of, you speak in terms of leadership, you're there on behalf of somebody. In this case, you're there on behalf of British Columbians. And that's why I think the future is so important. That's why I think leadership is more important than politics. So I do really believe in transparency and accountability.
On a more practical and near future ambition, how is your campaign running? Because we understand that for some other candidates, they have a vast resource of donation from corporate world, from they sign huge number of membership through their campaign. So how is your campaign going, and how you compare your campaign with others?
We're doing quite well. We're doing really good. But our campaign was different in the sense that we went out to these communities and talked to these people in person. We talked to them in restaurants, and then we talked to them in church basements. We talked to them in halls, all over. So our campaign was actually just meeting them in person and signing them up. That's what it was. And it was hard. It was really hard because BC is a huge place. But I was fortunate that I had a really good team, and we got to as many places across BC as we could. And our social media actually picked up once people knew there was a grassroots person running, and that there was a campaign that was actually willing to go to all corners of BC. So we did pretty good. We're still doing good, by the way.
And you mentioned about social media. Of course, social media has become a huge part in any political and social campaign. And how are you going to, or how are you utilizing social media in order to push forward your campaign? I was actually engaging with social media long before I became an MLA. I actually encouraged my organization, my council, to actually start up a Facebook page. And back then, I read an article in Maclean's that said, if you ignore social media, you'll be like those people who ignored the telephone or ignored the home computer. It's going to be the way people communicate. And so I got a head start in that, and I started to learn pretty quickly on how to communicate back and forth with people, because Facebook and Twitter is an interactive medium, and it's a good way to get messages out back and forth. For the campaign, we really didn't change anything in that regard, but a lot of people started to pick up on our social media platform,
And so that's just one of the things that we got to think about in terms of, say, what the millennials are thinking. The millennials are actually living in a different world. They're living in the world of technology, whether it be social media or interactive media, or even where cell phones are going in terms of the next generation. So social media plays a big part, but I was really glad that I had over 10 years of experience with social media.
Coming back to the leadership race, of course, different candidates are going to preach for different platforms, and sometimes this also creates division among BC Liberal Party members. So how are you going to mend those divisions and bridge everyone together if you are elected? And how are you going to change BC politics and stop those acrimonious division among political leaderships, political members, in order to have a unified BC?
Basically the same way I did it in my past. This is not my first leadership position. And every time you win an election like this, you've got to go in and you got to create a unified front. There's no different for the BC Liberals. But I think for the BC Liberals, we have one thing in common. We all want to see a good, strong province. Not only locally or regionally, we want to see it internationally. And so I think regardless of what happens at our campaigns and leadership campaigns, we all understand as BC Liberals, we need to get BC to a better place. That's a good starting point. But quite frankly, we got 28 MLAs from 28 different regions that have different opinions. And I do respect opinions. I do respect freedom of choice, freedom of information, freedom of speech. I respect all those. In fact, I've never actually turned away any real opinion regarding the future of British Columbia. I accept all opinions because I think that's a way we actually reflect a diverse population of British Columbia. We've got to talk about all of it because we're moving into a different era in terms of British Columbia and Canada.
You mentioned about economy, and let's talk about economy. Economy is very important for the future of BC. You also mentioned about that BC needs to look into the international community for our future. So could you iterate more on that and how you are going to approach our economic growth, and where are you going to look into for our economic future?
Well, it has to be international trade. That's where you have to start. Canada is a resource country. Yes, we can get into technology, but right now, the investment doesn't want to come to BC. Investment is not welcome in BC for all sectors, whether you're talking about mining, LNG, technology. It's not there. Nobody wants to come here and invest. They're going to the United States, they're going to Alberta, they're going elsewhere. That's going to hurt British Columbians. That's going to hurt future British Columbians in terms of millennials. So when you're talking about a strong economy, you've actually got to think about not only the international trade, but you got to think about the environment that you're creating for investment. 14% income tax, right? Corporate income tax. That's the income tax rate for businesses in BC. Nobody's going to come and pay that rate when they have 8% in Alberta, for example. And down in the United States, of course, that's a different story altogether. So that's one area that you have to address. But the other areas as well, you have to encourage manufacturing. You have to encourage value added. We could do it with LNG. We could do it with forestry. We could do it with mining. And the only thing holding them back is the investment just doesn't want to come here because they don't feel welcome. We've got to create the environment that welcomes investment.
So that's the first thing. Tear down those barriers for investment to come into BC.
Well, I'm an MLA in Terrace, so I'm not government. I'm a member of the Legislative Assembly. And over the last 4 years, I've had people from Asia, from India, from Africa coming into my office talking about setting up a business in Terrace. And other than being the MLA for the region, I don't have the authority to do that. So I always try to divert them to the provincial government, or I try to divert them to the federal government. But they keep coming back. They want to invest. And so I've been doing this job now since 2003 in terms of talking to investors. So I understand what it takes to actually encourage investment and welcome them in. And so I think that experience, I can relate that to municipalities and towns and cities all across BC. So yes, it's going to take a lot of work though. Lots of work.
So far are my questions about your campaign, your vision as leader of the BC Liberal Party. What do you have to say to the Chinese community and the Chinese community members who are supporting your campaign?
Happy New Year, Happy Chinese New Year, Year of the Tiger. But also, thank you. Thank you for welcoming me in. Thank you for actually introducing me to your culture. I see similarities, a lot of similarities. And I do understand some of the hardships you're going through, especially with the idea of racism and exclusion. And this is where I'd like to change the BC Liberals, because I didn't understand the political system of BC. I didn't understand it. But the more I talk with ethnic communities and the more I see them want to be included, the more I want to show them how to get included in the same way I learned. It's not just running for MLA. It's more than that. There's ways to get involved with the school boards. There's ways to get involved with municipal councils, mayors, MLAs, MPs. And I think right now, for the Chinese community in Richmond, for example, they're starting to understand that they have a voice in what we call democracy. I mean, the Chinese community is actually, I'm quite inspired by the movement of the Chinese Canadians to actually get involved with politics. Quite inspired. I tried to do that with First Nations, but there's not enough interest yet with First Nations to get involved with politics, which leads to governance. I mean, ultimately, that's what you want to be. You want to be government. You want to lead BC to a better place. Then you've got to understand politics at the ground level. And so I'm quite encouraged from what I'm seeing in the Chinese community.
You mentioned about that your community has many past experience like the Chinese community experienced 100 years ago, 50 years ago. And in Chinese community, we're facing a resurgence of racism towards our community. What do you have to say to us and to those people who are behind this resurgence of racism?
Well, you can't really put a finger on exactly who is actually behind the racism, but you can point some fingers at where it was actually allowed to grow. I mean, there was a narrative out there at one time, if everybody remembers, that the rising cost of a house was due to Chinese immigrants. There was even a paper put out by that. There was even a politician that said he agreed with that paper. Now we know that's wrong. We know it's wrong. There was also the idea that somehow the Chinese people in BC were responsible for COVID. That was wrong. And so I think in times of stress, people are looking for somebody to blame, and that's why I don't like division politics. Politicians jumped on that for the sake of getting votes, and that's wrong. You've got to call that out. You've got to condemn it. And unfortunately, you saw what was happening all around the world. It wasn't just BC; it was the United States as well. And you saw the interactions of different people when they were approaching Chinese people. And really, when you look at what I've seen in terms of Chinese in BC, they want the same thing as other British Columbians. They want to be able to succeed. They want to raise their family. That's what they want. It's nothing about rising house prices. And in fact, if anything else, nobody's really figured out the high cost of housing. They haven't figured out the solution. But we haven't seen an outright apology from these politicians who actually blame the Chinese for that. But that did heighten the racism against Chinese in BC.
I finished my question. Anything you think is worthwhile to mention to about your campaign and about the future of BC Liberal Party, about the future of British Columbia?
Only that we're really talking about change, and I'm no stranger to change. I used to be one of those people that opposed resource development. I actually came from a council that opposed resource development, a community for that matter, and it was really hard to change the idea that somehow economic development is wrong. But once we changed our attitude and our narrative, people started to succeed. And this is what I propose for the BC Liberals. We can change, we can bring in more people. The demographics of BC are changing so fast. 50,000 people are coming into BC every year, and they're coming mainly in the Lower Mainland. Well, if we're going to keep up, we've got to think about the demographics, and we've got to actually include those demographics in the future of BC Liberals. If we can do this, my ultimate goal is to change the future of British Columbia. Mainly because in my region, where we actually went through an economic recession with no jobs, no economy, we turned it around. Well, there's no reason why we can't do this for BC. BC, ultimately, being a gateway to Asia, we shouldn't be in the situation we are now. We shouldn't be there. We should actually be very healthy economic-wise, which actually in turn helps pay for those services that we want to see. We want to see more hospitals, more education, better highways. We want to see that. For that, we've got to actually think about a strong economy and not be ashamed about it. The one thing I will say is that I don't understand this when I look at ethnic communities. The ethnic communities have no problem talking about success. They have no problem talking about prosperity. There's no issue with it. But you go outside that circle, there seems to be a reluctance to talk about a strong economy, and I'm not embarrassed by it. I said in the debates a couple of times, I've developed a narrative for a strong economy and how that builds strong communities and strong people. I've developed that over 15 years. I'm not going to change it. I'm not going to apologize for it, because I come from the Indian Act, where there is no economy, and we're under oppressive unemployment and poverty. But turning that around is still one of the greatest things that I'm proud of to be a part of.
That really prompts my next question about a page in Canadian history which are really dark, because the day before yesterday there was a announcement from Williams Lake First Nations about human burials, unmarked human burials found on former St. Joseph Missionary School, residential school.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, there were evidence that victims are a lot more than the about 100 burials that were found. Do you think the history of residential school has been adequately addressed by the federal government, by the churches, and by RCMP? And if not, what do you think needs to be done?
I've never really engaged in that conversation. Both my parents went to residential school. I've never really engaged in whether or not enough was done or what else could be done. But I've actually thought more about how do we bring the societies back together. I mean, when you're talking about the remains, you're talking about decades of more work to understand where these remains came from. When you're talking about DNA identification, for example, I've always thought about, at the very least, we could do something highly symbolic of bringing the First Nation community back together with the non-First Nation community. I mean, that's what reconciliation means. Bring it back together. And when we first heard about this in Kamloops, I was actually touring around BC, and I was watching all the ceremonies across BC in terms of commemorating what they found at Kamloops. And the one thing I noticed was the majority of people in those crowds were non-Indigenous people that wanted to stand with the Indigenous people. That was in my lifetime. That was the first time I saw that. And so I was trying to think of a way, how do we do this on a larger scale with no politics? We don't need the government. I mean, right now, the Canadian society wants to do something. And this is a change from when I was back in leadership in 2006, when I found out about this. Not many people cared. I even did a booklet on it to kind of explain what had happened to Aboriginal people. Nobody read it. Today, I think society wants to know more and they want to fix it. That's a great place to start right there, because government has tried to fix it in the past, and for some reason it hasn't really resonated with Canadians, or it hasn't really resonated with Indigenous people. I think we need something larger to actually bring the societies together, because society wants it. To my friends in the Chinese community, thank you for your support. I really appreciate you welcoming me into your community. And I would like to wish you a Happy New Year, the Year of the Tiger. May it bring you success, health, and happiness. And voting day is Year of the Tiger, February 3rd. So thank you very much. Good luck in the new year, and we'll see you soon.